Hi, and welcome to what is probably going to be an anti-philosophy with Phil about Chanukah. Anti-philosophy with Phil in that Chanukah is a festival that's given me a lot of cause for question over the years, and I've always been taught to challenge my religion, to harbour doubt, and to fester, and to let it be a cause for challenging my religion and to asking questions. The only problem I have with Chanukah stories, every time I ask a question, the answers I get back are often either self-referential, involve circular arguments, circular logic, tautologies, and don't really answer the questions. And if anything, just raise more questions. And I think there's other leading Rabbonim that clearly had a problem with some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'd like to limit myself to specifically talking about the historical background to Chanukah and the reasons why we celebrate it. I'm sure everyone has their own areas of religion that they struggle with. This is mine, and it's quite specific. I know, but I hope you'll bear with me on it. I'll start with the background story. The story goes that following a revolt against the Greeks, when the Hasmoneans gained access to the temple, the only oil they could find that was suitable, i.e. that had a seal from the high priest, they only found one jug, and that jug should have lasted only 1 day, but by a miracle it lasted 8 days, which gave them enough time to press and process some fresh oil. Well, firstly, yes, they're called they're called Greeks colloquially, but we know they weren't. They were Assyrians or Seleucids. We'll call them Yevonim in Hebrew, and I think that's I'm on safer turf with that one. But actually, it wasn't. The fight wasn't against the Seleucids. It wasn't against any enemy army. It was civil war. The people they were fighting were Hellenized Jews that had turned against traditional Judaism. They were called Mishyanim in Hebrew, and it was a time of bitter infighting and conflict. The access that they gained to the temple, the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, was very short-lived, perhaps a few decades. But if you look at it through a chart of history of the time, it was a blip. And there were times that the Jews did have access to the temple, and there were times that they didn't. And this was one of the times that they did. But to be specific about the oil and the jug that they found, well, firstly, the high priest's seal only went on jugs of oil that he himself would use for his own personal sacrifices, his own personal meal offerings that would involve oil. And that oil was of a lesser quality than the other oil they would have found in the temple. The problem was that other oil was impure or defiled or opened. But saying that, there's no problem with using defiled oil in the menorah, halachically speaking, under Jewish law. In fact, because it would have been of a better quality, it would have been better off to use that oil to use in the menorah and not rely on a miracle. They shouldn't have been using the high priest oil, in other words. What was more problematic was that the menorah itself was tainted, was impure. And the Gemara, again, quite openly says that what they lit was not a menorah. It was differences of opinions differ. Some say it was a wooden replica, some say it was an iron replica, a metal replica. But for certain, the Gemara has no qualms about saying it was not a menorah that they lit. The miracle did not involve a menorah. And as I say, when we talk about a miracle, it needn't have been a miracle. There was no need for this to have happened. So that's the historical background, which, as I say, to me raises some troubling questions. But if we look at the reasons behind the festival, two are given, both of which are rarely seen together. and perhaps I'll explain why at the end. One is the military victory of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabee family, and the other is the miracle of the oil. Well, let's start with the military victory. Well, as I've said, firstly, it was not a military victory against the Assyrians. They were in charge of the land of Israel before, during, and after the story. There was no change in ownership there. It was a civil war. The Maccabee family, funnily enough, well, not funnily enough, that's the wrong word. Unfortunately, were virtually wiped out in this coup. Only one survived, and he went on to found what was going to be one of the most corrupt regimes in Jewish history. The Maccabees were a family of priests, of Kohanim. That's how they were allowed to get access to the temple. And yet they took on the mantle of kingship, which they were forbidden from doing under Jewish law. And they are allowed under certain circumstances, but there was no reason for them to do it. It was a power grab. They then went on to themselves become Hellenized, pandering up to the Greek and Assyrian authorities, and later Simon Maccabee became a leader of what became the Sadducees, a major faction that stood in opposition to the Pharisees, which we'll talk about in a minute. A question that's often asked is why there is no Masechta in Mishnah, in the oral law, in the Talmud, devoted to Chanukah, in the same way that there is one devoted to Purim, Megillah. The Masechta Megillah talks about Purim. And an answer that's given by the Chasam Sofer, although some say it wasn't him, it was someone else, is that the author of the Mishnah was himself a Levi, and he was so embarrassed by what his kinsman from the tribe of Levi, the Kohanim, had done and went on to become during the Chanukah story. He felt embarrassed and he wasn't happy to include the story or the laws in the Talmud. And as a result, it gets very much incidental mentions in Mishnah. You hear about it in Megillah, where it talks about the laning on Chanukah and the number of aliyahs you call up. It talks about briefly about what happens to a menorah if it gets knocked over, who's responsible for damages. There are incidental mentions of Chanukah, but nothing concrete, certainly. So when we talk about the military victory, not something which is what is emphasised, by the way, in the book of Maccabees. It's not something that really went on to produce much good for the Jewish people. So if we're not going to talk about the military victory, let's talk about the miracle of the oil. The oil that should have lasted one day, but in fact went on to last 8 days. Well, I'm not going to say that anyone lied, but who would have seen this miracle in action? It would have been the Maccabees, who, as we've seen, had their own propaganda agenda and their own reasons for wanting to validate their authority. You know, it's a sort of miracle where could someone have tampered with the oil, added more oil at night? Was it the same oil that lasted 8 days? Did they use the impure oil? Who could have told what the difference was? Could the Maccabees have somehow tweaked things a bit? It's not the sort of miracle that we celebrate in Judaism. It's not like a national miracle where things suddenly changed like they did at Purim, where a global Holocaust was averted, or the miracles that we see elsewhere in the books of the prophets or the writings. It's a difficult miracle to put your finger on. It's not very easy to verify. In fact, the miracle is omitted from both books of Maccabees, which were fairly contemporaneous. It's not mentioned in the Moatzur song that we sing on Chanukah. And it's only obscurely mentioned in Al Hanissim, which is the prayer that we add into the Amidah and to Birchas Hamazon on Chanukah. In fact, the Book of Maccabees describes the 8-day festival as being a reenactment of Sukkot, or Sukkot. I'm not quite 100% comfortable with all of that. A theory that has been put forward is that it was the Pharisees who wrote the Talmud and wanted to emphasize more the miracle of the oil versus the military victory, whereas the Sadducees, who wrote the Book of Maccabees, wanted to emphasize the military victory. And let's be honest, military victories in Jewish history, not something we tend to celebrate. Bloodshed isn't great. As I've said, many Jews died in this battle. And that's not something to celebrate, really. I want to end by saying that regardless of what doubts I have, Chanukah is a tremendous festival of light. It represents what Judaism is all about. Light. In other words, Torah. Times change, attitudes change, society changes, morals become relative. But Judaism has been, is, and always will be a shining light. It will be, Torah stands true regardless. And that's what we stand for. If anything, we grow more, we grow bigger. For each day of Chanukah, we light more and more candles, which is an interesting reason as to why we're told in the Gemara different people celebrated Chanukah in different ways. Some people lit one candle for one day, for each day of Chanukah. Some people light more, as we do now. 1 on the first day, 2 on the second, 3 on the third, and so on. Because Torah transmission is different for different people. And Chanukah represents that Torah, the light that we shine. Light that is rising upwards, defying gravity, that combines the elements of the solids of the wick, the liquid of the oil, and the fire and energy of the flame. Torah that is eternally true. And it's like, historically, the last of the festivals. It's like we're having a sign-off and saying, okay guys, if you're going to look at what contribution Judaism has made to Western civilization, this is it. This is what we give you. Torah. The Judeo-Christian ethic, if you like. What has stood for by most Western civilizations, which most of them have used as the basis for having a judicial system, for the basis for having human rights, for the basis for civil rights, and for all sorts of other things that we take for granted in modern day civilization. That's Judaism's contribution to the Western world. It's the knowledge the knowledge that we have, the Torah that we have, that brings us closer to our Maker, our Creator. That's what Judaism is about. That's what Chanukah is about. It's about, at the time, it's no coincidence that it happens at the time of the winter solstice, when darkness, the times of darkness, the hours of darkness are outnumbering the hours of daylight. We are that light. It's our duty to be that light and to shine forth for others and to help others. Thank you for watching, and happy Chanukah.